and they kind of totally outgunned the English. But so there's a kind of a standoff really. The English were in this anchorage. The English didn't want to fight, obviously, because they were outgunned, but also they're in a bad way. They had to repair from the storm damage. So they went and negotiated and said, look, there's plenty of room in this anchorage for all of us. We'll shift up. You come in this end, you'll line up, and we'll all line up, and we'll just make our repairs and we'll go on our way. And the Spanish agreed to that. So the English shifted up, and the Spanish ships all came in. So if you can picture it, they're all lined up. There's a long island parallel to the shore, and in between the shore and the island, there are all these ships in rows where their prow is against the island, and the stern is facing towards the shore. And there's all the English ships in a row, and then there's all the Spanish ships in a row, all next to each other in one long line. And for a few days, everything's cool. Like, they're just hanging out. The English are making their repairs, and the Spanish are doing whatever they're doing, repairing their damage from the Atlantic crossing and preparing to go into Veracruz, and with all this enormous amount of produce and stuff they've brought from Spain to New Spain. And then, but unknown to the English, almost immediately upon arriving, the Spanish sent word to Veracruz, just a few miles down the coast, to say, bring up soldiers. And then a few nights in, they'd been preparing to attack the English the whole time. And the English were starting to be suspicious about all the activity that was going on. And they sent a negotiator to say, is everything cool? Like, everything's cool between us, yeah? Like, we're still cool, yeah? And the Spanish were like, yeah. Everything's cool. Everything's fine. We're just, we like you guys. Everything's cool. And all the sailors are on shore, so the English sailors and the Spanish sailors are getting drunk and all that kind of stuff. But the whole time, the Spanish are planning this night attack. In the afternoon of the attack, the English sent their negotiator back again to say, look, it kind of seems like there's stuff going on the mainland. Like, it looks like there's loads of guys over there. Like, maybe are they all wearing breastplates and helmets and stuff? And the Spanish were like, we're just going to take you prisoner now. So the English negotiator, I think he was like the master of one of the ships, or maybe he was a gentleman, I can't remember. They just said, okay, well, we're just going to keep you here now. So they kept him on the flagship. And then in the night, it's a bit confusing exactly what happened, but there was all of these Spanish soldiers started to amass in the merchant ship, which was next to the ship called the Minion. And the men on the Minion were like, there's loads of guys charging into this ship. And all the merchant ships, they started to cut gun ports in the sides of their ships. And the English are like, you're cutting gun ports into extra gun ports to put more cannons facing us from the sides of your ships. And the Spanish were like, no, that's just cargo hatches. Like, don't worry about that. We got to a point where the English were like, this is something definitely happening now. And then apparently what happened is there was an archer. This is a weird time where you've got firearms, but also people are still using bows and arrows. It's kind of a weird time. But there was an archer in the fighting tops on the Minion. And he saw a guy either on the deck of the merchant ship or leaning out of a gun port, waving a flag on a pole. And they were like, well, that's definitely something, isn't it? So the English archer shot the guy who was waving the flag, and that kind of slightly scuppered their secret plans to a certain extent. But anyway, all hell broke loose. The Spanish started playing trumpets, like the attack trumpet sounds, to all out attack. And then from the land, immediately dozens of boats packed with men set off, and they're pulling really hard for the English ships and for the island. And the Spanish attacked the island and the gun battery that was on the island, and they killed the English that were protecting it and took the gun battery and turned the gun battery on the English ships. At the same time, they, on the merchant ship, threw grappling hooks and cables across to the Minion and started heaving the ships together. And then so they got closed together. And then the merchant ship was, by this point, packed with hundreds of Spanish soldiers. And they started boarding the Minion, just charging across. And then the English started trying to send people across to the Minion to try and protect it. So there was this massive boarding action on the deck of the Minion, where you've got the English sailors fighting proper Spanish soldiers. And the Spanish soldiers were famously the best soldiers in the world at that point. They were disciplined and well equipped and all the rest of it. But the English managed to fight them off, managed to get them back onto the merchant ship, cut the cables, and also cut the cables to the land, and and pull their way out into the channel. This was happening at night. I think it was happening at night. And then everyone starts firing cannons. So it turns into a huge sea battle in like really close confines. So they're kind of like a couple of boat lengths between a lot of these ships. And they start pulling out into the channel, and the Spanish warships start pulling out into the channel to start firing, and the great big Jesus of Lubeck ship goes out to kind of pulls out into the channel to start firing onto the merchant ship, and the shore battery is turned onto the smaller English ships, and just starts hammering them from point blank range, killing just dozens and dozens of English people, English sailors, and then they sink 2 or 3 of the smaller English ships. The English also firing their cannons as fast as possible, and they managed to blow up one of the merchant ships. Like it hits the powder store or whatever and blows up and sets fire to it, and it burns down to the waterline.
Yes.
Another ship gets another ship gets hammered completely. I think both of the Spanish warships end up being destroyed or sunk, and 2 or 3 of the huge merchant ships end up getting destroyed or sunk. But still, the English get absolutely hammered. The Jesus of Lubeck is the big ship, but it's so old, the timbers are really rotten and stuff, and that gets destroyed and sunk. And all of the survivors from the Jesus of Lubeck jump onto the...
Would you say that
onto
this
the Minion.
so I was just going to say, do you think that this is like probably the first action, or the first sort of hot action, where it was a Cold War before, and it ultimately all ends in the Armada and an invasion attempt? This is sort of the first, hot action in a war between Spain and England.
Yeah, definitely, I would say that. And I've seen in some books say that it didn't actually matter that much. It mattered most to Hawkins and Drake and that kind of thing. But actually, in terms of the geopolitical situation before and after, it didn't actually change very much at all. And that might be true, but for the people at the time, especially the English sailors, especially English sailors from Devon, and then these individual people that were there, it certainly was, for them, the start of a war that they then fought for the rest of their lives, however they could. And Drake said that explicitly as well. So there's some little details about
it carved something into Drake's psyche.
Definitely, yeah, massively. That's him saying that. He says that explicitly. From that day on, he was committed to vengeance, committed to destroying Spain and that kind of stuff. So it's kind of it must have been absolute hell, because they lost hundreds of men, and so the Jesus starts sinking, and then they're abandoning the ship, grabbing whatever they can get, and they're jumping from the higher up deck of the stern castle of the Jesus down, I don't know, 10 feet or whatever, to the stern castle of the Minion, as the ship's kind of pulling apart to escape. The cannons still going, like some of these galleons are on fire, burning. There's hundreds of firearms going off, and there's the English, last chance of escape. The Jesus, the huge bulk of the Jesus is kind of blocking the channel, and being a shield is like peppered and holed and sinking, and the Minion is using it as a shield, and everyone's abandoning that ship for that one, and it starts pulling away. And some of them, including I think Hawkins himself, is one of the last men to jump as the ships are pulling apart from each other, jump down from one ship to the other as it pulls away. And I think one of Hawkins' cousins, or maybe his younger brother, is running up with an armful of treasure, with like a silver platter under one arm and a giant golden goblet under the other. And he comes sprinting up from the hold up to the stern castle, and then he reaches the side just as it's like 6 feet away, 10 feet away, 15 feet away, pulling away, and he's standing there with this treasure in his arms, watching the ship disappear. And him and quite a few others are captured by the Spanish, and most of them never get home, and most of them are tortured by the Inquisition, and some of them repent and become Catholic, and some of them are thrown in prison for their whole life. Some of them end up as galley slaves, basically pulling an oar in the Mediterranean for the rest of their life. And then over the next sort of 10, 20 years, you kind of, back in England, they start to hear about what's happened to all these people. And some of their account, like when these guys were captured, they were questioned by the Inquisition and the authorities. What were you doing here? Like, who was your commander? Who was on the ship? All this kind of stuff. So we know a lot this particular event and the voyage from the accounts of these prisoners being questioned by the Spanish. So it's horrific, like it may have been better to have been one of the ones killed, because a lot of them were tortured to death, or just lived in prison for their whole life. Just horrific. So the only ships that got away were the Minion, and then this tiny ship that was commanded by Francis Drake. That was the only two. And this is another thing that happened, which it was important in Drake's character, I think, where so his ship was so little and basically unarmed, he couldn't really take part in the battle as such. He was just kept out of the way, and then when the ships were going down, he came in and took loads of people off of the the Jesus and sailed back out again. And then his ship and the Minion were separated. And then the Minion hung around the next day trying to find Drake, but they couldn't find him. And what happened is Drake had basically and then just immediately cut out for England and headed home. And that was a serious black mark against his name for the rest of his life, where
Right,
even
yeah.
Hawkins makes reference to it and says it doesn't specify him by name in his report to the government, but he does say like certain persons abandoned us or something like something really explicit. And there was he had this massive falling out. But in Drake's defence, he was probably had a ship that was he did have a ship that was massively overcrowded. So it was only this really little tiny ship. So if it was rated at, I think it was 25 tons. It was over 25 or 32, certainly no more than that. So that might have been about big enough to contain 25 or 32 huge, like 1 ton barrels, basically. So a really small ship. It might have had a crew of about, if it was packed, it might have had a crew of 30 or maybe 40 at the most. But they had more than that on there. He might have had about 80 men packed onto the ship without anywhere near the amount of food and water necessary to feed them all. And what happened is some of them demanded to be put ashore on the mainland, and he sailed up to like the north part. I think it was either Florida or a very, very northern part of Mexico. And they, like a group of them said, including some gentlemen, I think, we're not going to take our chances in this tiny packed boat going across. Can you put us ashore and we'll make our way back to the Spanish authorities and hand ourselves in? And that's what they did. And this little group walked, I don't know how many hundreds of miles through kind of Indian territory, fighting with the Indians and stuff, and made their way back to the kind of the Spanish Mexico and said, we're Englishmen and we put ashore. And they were immediately clapped in irons and tortured and just treated terribly, and a lot of them died. And so yeah, that was terrible. And then Drake managed to get the rest of them back across the Atlantic to England they were in a terrible way when they got back, as did Hawkins. And his ship again they were in a terrible state. Loads of them had died during the journey. They had limped across the Atlantic, barely made it. And then both of them, well, Hawkins didn't do any more voyages after that. So he was to some extent shattered by it. You know, he didn't even try to go back out again. He did then go, and he was still a big deal. Like, he did then fight in the Armada and all that kind of stuff, but his grand voyaging days were over. Whereas Drake, it lit a fire under him for the rest of his life. He was so filled with vengeance and outrage at the Spanish treachery that he was then, from that point on, committed to waging a personal war against Spain, no matter what it took. So that's kind of, in a lot of ways, that was the key moment in his life.
Right, yeah. I got a quote here. Can I read a quote? I guess it's about the right moment for it. It's from Churchill. He says, quote, John Hawkins had learned his seamanship in slave running on the West African coast and in shipping Negroes to the Spanish colonies. Can I say Negroes? I guess.
In a historical context, yes.
He had, moreover, educated an apt pupil, a young adventurer from Devon, Francis Drake. This master thief of the unknown world, as the Spanish contemporaries called Drake, became the terror of their ports and crews. His avowed object was to force England into open conflict with Spain, and his attacks on the Spanish treasure ships, his plundering of Spanish possessions on the western coast of the South American continent on his voyage around the world in 1577, and raids on Spanish harbours in Europe, all played their part in driving Spain to war. End quote.
Nice. Yeah, sums it up pretty well. Yeah, so from that point on, he was... Sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say one other thing one of the things about Drake is that there were multiple things in his life that were crazy adventures that were enough for one person. Most people in history, they usually just do one thing, like they're president once, like John Adams, for example, or but there's a few people where there's multiple things, like Eisenhower, for example. He was both the supreme commander in World War II and president. It's kind of two things you could say about it. But Drake, it's like 3 or 4. It's incredible. Anyway, I'll let you carry on.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, he's, especially from this point on, he was suddenly inspired, really. And I think one of the things that, not only was he then committed to revenge in some fashion, he'd learned from these voyages, from the last one, that actually that isn't going to work anymore. Like the Hawkins style slave trading thing, it doesn't work. The Spanish have adapted their wives to it. it's not going to work again. But one of the things he did see in that voyage was the fact that you could do whatever you wanted in the West Indies. And as long as you didn't get pinned down by the Spanish anywhere, they couldn't do anything to stop you. So from that point on, Drake's new ventures were basically essentially piracy. He wasn't trying to trade anymore with the Spanish. He wasn't trying to do what Hawkins did. When he decided, I'm going to carry this on, with or without Hawkins, I'm not going to be a slave trader. I'm not going to try and trade goods. I'm not doing buying and selling. I'm going to be a pirate, basically. So he might not have thought of it in terms of piracy exactly. He might have thought, he's a privateer. He's waging the war, like you said. He's waging a war on Spain in the way he knows how, and also getting filthy rich at the same time, which is nice work if you can get it. So he took all of the money that he made in those voyages and used them to buy 2 really small ships. I think they're called the Swan and the Dragon or something. And he took them with about 70 men, something like that, back across to the West Indies. And he did a couple of little, he took some ships and they raided a couple of little towns, but it was really kind of quite low key. And I think what he said later was that he was just scoping things out. He was just testing out what you could do, and he was learning the lie of the land, and just getting a feel for what could be accomplished. But he still come back making a profit, and then he did a couple more trips like that, gradually getting a bit bigger each time, taking the money that he'd made, reinvesting it, and getting more investors as well. So he was proving that I can sail there and back with impunity. I can make loads of money. Give me some money, I'll bring it back with interest, type thing. And one of the things that he saw when he went out there was the vulnerability of the Spanish treasure fleet. Well, not the fleet exactly, but the Spanish treasure route. So the Spanish treasure fleet was this flotilla of massive, heavily armed galleons. And the Spanish knew that this was obviously this annual fleet that left New Spain for Spain with all these riches laden with bullion, gold and silver from the mines. Obviously, people are going to potentially attack those ships, right? So they made sure right from the start they were big, heavily armed fleets, that there weren't really any navies that could even conceivably attack them, right? They made sure the Spanish knew how vulnerable that was. But what they hadn't considered was the fact that the gold was flowing up from Peru and Chile up along the coast in these little small vessels that were transporting shipments up to Panama, to the city of Panama, which was on the Pacific coast of Central America, right? And they were being collated in these big warehouses until they had a huge amount. And then they would put all this bullion onto pack mules and then hike across the hills, through the jungle, over the hills and down to the Caribbean side, where they would be stored in another warehouse until the fleet arrived, and then they'd be loaded onto the fleet and sailed to Spain. And Drake realised, well, why don't we just land men and creep through the jungle and just take the bullion from the mules, just cut it off right there. That's the vulnerability.
Yeah, there's one thing though that I think about this. So Drake and all his men must have had really good intelligence about all. Like, you would have thought it would have been one of the most closely guarded secrets, but it seems Drake somehow knew everything about it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting things about Drake, actually, is that he was a master of intelligence, and he made sure that whatever port he put in, he was paying people. Whenever he took a ship, he would grill the people on it for information. Where was this ship? Where was that ship? Where were they going? So he understood exactly what was going on in the area. But the other thing that's really interesting about him, that kind of makes him stand out from his day, is that he would befriend the black slaves and the Native American Indians wherever he went, right from the start. So, like, bear in mind, he was on at least one slaving raid, right? He took part in 3 slaving voyages. So he was witness to slavery. But then when he had his own command, he never took part in any slavery at all. And every time he attacked a vessel, like a Portuguese or Spanish vessel, and took it, and it had slaves on board, he would free the slaves. And the other thing is, he was always trying to befriend like the local Indian tribes. That's what happened in this case. So ever since the Spanish have been taking people from Africa to New Spain, those people have been escaping in the New World at times. 1 or 2 or big kind of groups of them would break out, and they would go and live in the jungle. And then they were called the Cimarrones, I think that's what they're called. And they were all over the place. And they'd form these little villages just outside of Spanish control, and sometimes they would live with or have some Native Americans with them, or they were just escaped black slaves. And there were these little communities, and some of them would survive. Some of them would not make it because that was incredibly hard living, but some of them were out there. And Drake made contact with a lot of these people, and they obviously hated the Spanish because they were the ones that had enslaved them. And Drake was always say to them, "I'm an enemy of Spain, like you. Let's work together, and we'll all get rich together." And that's what he said to these guys that were living on the Isthmus of Panama in that area. And he said, "Tell me about the treasure and stuff," because a lot of these people had escaped from Panama and had escaped from the other place on the Caribbean coast, so they had insider knowledge of this route.
So it was an inside job to some extent.
Yeah. He would befriend these people and then use what they knew, and actually worked in partnership with them. Like he took them on this road with them, or like they led him. So